At my own brother's award ceremony, security stopped me. "Show, ma'am, you're not on the list." "Oh, my brother, Ethan," smirked at his wife. "My sister is just a useless desk jockey. She should have married a real officer. He had no idea my desk job was about to save his life and destroy his pride on the exact same day." And my name is Sophia Hayes. I am 34 years old, and on this brilliant May morning, the very air I breathed felt like a prelude to a familiar betrayal. It came in on the salty, sharp wind as I drove my car over the majestic arch of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the sun glinting off the water in a way that felt far too cheerful for the occasion. Ahead lay the hallowed grounds of the United States Naval Academy, Annapolis, a place where the stoic red brick walls seemed to hum with whispers of honor, discipline, and a very specific masculine brand of duty. Onise, I found a parking space. I watched them, the proud military families, their postures straight, their faces beaming as they strolled across the immaculate green lawns. Their sons and daughters, the midshipmen, stood like statues in their pristine dress whites, the embodiment of a legacy I was born into, but never truly allowed to claim. A quiet, complicated knot of pride for my younger brother Ethan tightened in my chest. It was a feeling I had learned to temper over the years, to shield with a well-worn layer of resignation. I knew my role today. It was a part I had been playing for 15 years. A well-rehearsed performance as the supportive older sister, the quiet footnote in the grand story of the family hero. I was a shadow, a name whispered in the background. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I steeled myself to once again play the part of the sister with the desk job. At the main security checkpoint, I wore a simple beige trench coat I'd deliberately chosen to conceal the crisp uniform beneath it, hiding the rank that rested on my shoulders. A young petty officer, his jaw set with the seriousness of his post, took my ID. He was all professionalism until his eyes scanned the guest list on his tablet. He looked up at me, a crease of confusion forming between his brows. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said, his voice polite but firm, trained to be unwavering. "I don't have a Sophia Hayes on the guest list for Lieutenant Hayes." He turned the tablet screen toward me, a gesture of proof that the error was not his. "The list I have is Captain David Hayes, Mrs. Margaret Hayes, and Mrs. Jessica Hayes, the lieutenant's wife." And then he read each name with military precision. David Hayes, Margaret Hayes, Jessica Hayes. Each one was a small, sharp hammer blow against my ribs. The absence of my own name was louder than any of theirs. This was not a clerical error. This was not an oversight. This was a deliberate, calculated act of erasure. Onise, if summoned by the thought, the gleaming, ostentatious black SUV my family favored pulled up to the gate. The door opened and Ethan emerged looking every inch the conquering hero in his perfectly tailored dress whites, the uniform seemingly radiating its own light against his tanned skin. He saw me standing there, saw the guard's apologetic stance, and a slow, knowing smirk, the kind of victory only a lifelong rival can truly savor, played on his lips. Instead of stepping forward to vouch for his own sister, he leaned toward his wife, Jessica, and said, his voice carrying with perfect clarity for both the guard and me to hear, "Probably some paperwork mix-up. She should have married a real officer instead of playing with spreadsheets, and the cruelty of it was breathtaking." My mother, Margaret, suddenly found the clasp of her antique pearl brooch to be the most fascinating object in the world, her hands fluttering in a theatrical gesture of avoidance. My father, David, a retired captain, simply scowled, his face a mask of deep, impatient annoyance, not for the insult, but for the public scene his daughter was causing. They didn't even look back. They walked past the checkpoint, leaving me behind as if I were a piece of luggage someone had misplaced. A lost item no one cared enough to claim, and a hot, creeping blush that had nothing to do with the sun washed over my face. Ethan's words were a slap, but my parents' silence was the true poison. It was complicity. It was the final quiet confirmation of a lifetime of being told I was less. And the young petty officer, now trapped in this excruciating family drama, began to speak, his voice laced with professional discomfort. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." And I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply stood there, my posture rigid, my spine a rot of ice, and watched them go. I watched them disappear into the hallowed grounds that had rejected me on their command. And in that moment of profound public abandonment, the hurt didn't vanish. It simply crystallized. It cooled and hardened into something else entirely. A decision formed in my mind as cold and hard as steel. In fine, let them believe it. Eon dangerous calm settled over me. The storm inside me went still, its chaotic energy consolidating into a single sharp point of focus. In today's performance would be one for the ages. He would not see a single tear. I would not give them that satisfaction. Kin standing there on the manicured grounds of the academy, an outcast at the gate, I felt the present moment dissolve. The sting of Ethan's words became a key, unlocking a vault of memories I had long kept under guard. The cool, controlled woman I was now faded, and in her place stood the ghost of a teenage girl, forever standing on the outside of a circle of light looking in. In the memory that surfaced first was drenched in the smell of charcoal and freshly cut grass. It was the day Ethan's acceptance letter to the academy had arrived. My father, a man who rarely showed emotion beyond a stoic nod or a stern frown, had transformed. He'd thrown a massive backyard barbecue, inviting what felt they were like every retired and active duty officer within a 50-mile radius. He stood by the grill, tongs in one hand and a beer in the other, his voice booming with a pride he never used for me. He draped an arm around Ethan's shoulders and introduced him again and again as the heir to the Hayes legacy. Later, my mother brought out a huge sheet cake from the local bakery, the kind with overly sweet frosting and airbrush decorations. In bold blue letters it read, "Congratulations, future Admiral." The whole world, it seemed, had stopped spinning for this one moment. It wasn't just a party. It was a coronation, a public declaration of the chosen son. And I, his older sister, was just a commoner in the crowd, a spectator at a ceremony held in my own backyard. I smiled, I clapped, and I felt utterly and completely invisible. In the universe has a cruel sense of irony. That very same week, I had won a National Science Fair award. My project, a complex cryptographic algorithm, had been recognized as one of the most promising in the country. I remember holding the award in my hands, a heavy gold-plated medal on a thick ribbon. For a few hours I had allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps this, I thought, would be enough. I found my father by the fireplace that evening reading the Wall Street Journal. I approached him tentatively, the way a child offers a drawing, my heart pounding with a desperate need for his approval. "Dad?" I'd said, my voice barely a whisper. I won." He held out the medal. He took it, his eyes barely leaving his newspaper. He glanced down at the intricate engraving, his expression unchanging. "Good job, sweetie," he murmured, the words automatic, devoid of any real warmth. He handed it back to me and then folded his paper. "I was just thinking Ethan is going to need a serious physical training regimen to get ready for pleb summer." Nan, just like that, the moment was over. The subject, as always, had returned to Ethan. The gold medal in my hand suddenly felt heavy, not with the weight of achievement, but with the dead weight of disappointment. Its shine seemed to dim under the fluorescent lights of our living room. Later that night, alone in my bedroom, I opened an old wooden box where I kept forgotten things, childhood trinkets, old letters. I placed the metal inside, nestled it between a dried core and a silver dollar from my grandfather, and I closed the lid. It became a secret I kept from the world, a silent, painful reminder that my victories, no matter how significant in my own world, were simply invisible in theirs. And that feeling of invisibility crystallized a few years later on the evening I told them my own career choice. I had gathered all my courage to announce that I had been accepted into the Naval Intelligence Program. My father muted the TV, his face hardening into the mask of disapproval I knew so well. He stared at me across the coffee table, his silence more intimidating than any shout. "Isn't it intelligence?" he finally said, the word tasting like an insult on his tongue. "That's a support role, Sophia. It's for people who can't make it in combat. The Hayes family are not support staff. I mean, my mother, ever the peacekeeper, jumped in with a placating smile. "Now, David," she'd said softly, laying a hand on his arm. "Perhaps it's safer for her that way." In her words were meant to be a comfort, but they were a dagger safer for her. The implication was clear. I was weak, fragile, in need of protection, not suited for the real glorious danger that men like my father and brother were born for. They didn't see my choice as strategic, as a different kind of warfare fought with intellect and analysis. They saw it only as a deviation from the path of glory they had laid out, a quiet failure to uphold the family tradition. That was the foundation upon which my entire career was built, on their dismissal. That was the fuel. The quiet, burning resentment from 1,000 tiny cuts had forged a resolve in me that they could never understand. And my family thinks I play with spreadsheets. They picture me in a sterile government office, a beige cubicle, my greatest daily challenge, a paper jam in the printer. The bitter irony is that they're not entirely wrong about the sterile part. They just have no concept of what that sterility truly contains. They know nothing of the place we call the tank-ignited facility, buried deep underground, shielded from any form of electronic eavesdropping. The air is cold, recycled, and carries the low, constant hum of powerful servers. There are no windows. The only light comes from the giant curved wall of screens in front of me, a mosaic of glowing maps, drone feeds, and cascading lines of code. This was my office. This was my battlefield. Sis and I remember one particular night, a Tuesday that bled into a Wednesday. The air in the tank was thick with a tension you could almost taste. We were coordinating a high-risk hostage rescue in the Red Sea. A civilian oil tanker had been boarded by pirates, and a dozen lives hung in the balance. My team of analysts fed me data streams in a quiet, focused rhythm, their voices low and steady in my earpiece. My job was to see the whole board to connect the dots faster than our enemy could. Sinan Viper 1. Confirm target location. "You are 2 mics out," I said into my headset, my voice calm, betraying none of the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The main screen, a satellite thermal image showed a cluster of heat signatures on the tanker's deck. "Eagle Eye, give me thermal resolution on the bridge. I need a personnel count." And the image sharpened. 7 hostiles, 12 hostages huddled together. The lives of a SEAL team, Viper 1, depended on my next series of commands, on my ability to process and predict. This wasn't a spreadsheet. This was a high-stakes chess match where the pawns were human lives, and I was the one moving the most important pieces across the board. In it was in that moment of peak concentration, as I was about to give the green light that my personal cell phone, tucked away in my pocket, vibrated. It was a jarring, unwelcome intrusion from another world. For a split second, I considered ignoring it, but protocol was protocol. I pulled it out. It was a text from Ethan. In the message glowed on the small screen, a beacon of casual ignorance from a world away. Enjoying your weekend in DC? Hitting the museums, I bet. Don't work too hard on those reports. Sayas Any read the words, and a cold, bitter wave of irony washed over me. Here I was in a life-or-death struggle against armed traffickers, my mind stretched to its absolute limit. And in his world, I was his boring older sister, a tourist in my own life, drowning in paperwork. The condescending nickname, SIS, felt like a final twist of the knife. I took a breath, my fingers tightening on the phone for a second before I thumbed the power button, plunging the screen into darkness. I slipped it back into my pocket. My focus snapped back to the wall of screens, my voice emerging colder and sharper than before. "In standby, Viper 1, I commanded, my eyes catching a flicker of movement on a secondary feed. A small fishing boat, unlit, approaching the tanker from the stern. It wasn't on any maritime charts. It was a ghost. It's someone eagle eye. Focus on that tooler. Now, the thermal image zoomed in. The boat was cold, but the shapes inside were not. 6 more heat signatures, armed in ambush. They were waiting for the SEALs to board. Viper 1, abort. Abort. My voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the tank. I repeat, abort the breach. You have a secondary hostile force approaching from your 6. They're walking you into a kill box. And a wave of relief, silent and profound, washed through the room as the SEAL team confirmed the new orders. My analysis in that split second had just saved their lives. In hours later, at 3 a.m., I finally returned to my empty apartment in Washington, D.C. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The city lights twinkled through my window, a galaxy of strangers, none of whom knew what had just transpired in the darkness on the other side of the world. I walked to the liquor cabinet, my movements heavy, and poured a generous 2 fingers of Kentucky bourbon into a heavy glass. No ice. It and I stood by the window, swirling the amber liquid. The silence of the room a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of my work. I thought about the men of Viper 1, teammates whose faces I would never see, whose thanks I would never hear. I thought about the string of victories attributed to anonymous intelligence sources. Solitude was the price of this silent power. My family thought I pushed paper. They had no idea that those papers held the fates of nations, that the ink from my pen could move armies and shift the balance of power. They saw a desk job. I saw a global chessboard. And I had long ago accepted the terms of my service. I accepted the loneliness, the secrecy, the crushing weight of it all, because the mission was always more important than a wounded ego. Unhope arrived when I least expected it, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet of a corner office in the Pentagon. It smelled of worn leather, old books, and freshly brewed coffee. 2 days after the Red Sea operation, 2 days after Ethan's text message had sliced through the tension of the tank, I was summoned by General Miller. And then he was my commanding officer, a 4-star general with a reputation for being as brilliant as he was tough. His office overlooked the PTOAC, and the walls were covered not with medals, but with maps and photographs of him with soldiers in the field. He gestured for me to sit as he walked over to a coffee machine, humming quietly in the corner. "Sentin, you look exhausted, Sophia," he said, his back to me. His use of my first name was unusual, a sign that this was not a formal debriefing. He turned around and handed me a heavy ceramic mug filled with steaming black coffee. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of my life, it felt monumental. And he sat down behind his large mahogany desk and looked at me, his gaze direct and piercing, yet completely devoid of judgment. It was the kind of look that made you feel seen, truly seen. Not just as a subordinate or a set of skills, but as a person. "Judd, you saved 12 lives the other night," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. and the lives of the entire SEAL team. The official report won't have your name on it for obvious reasons. But I know, and the president knows. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding mine. You should be proud of that. And I stared at him, the warmth from the coffee mug seeping into my cold hands. For a moment, I couldn't speak. In my world, praise was a foreign language. The concept of being seen for what I did, rather than what I failed to be, was so alien that my mind struggled to process it. I felt a crack form in the icy facade I had so carefully constructed around myself. I wasn't Captain Hayes' daughter. I wasn't Ethan's overshadowed sister. In this room with this man, I was just Sophia. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. Then he let the silence hang for a moment, allowing his words to land. Then he continued. The Joint Chiefs have been discussing Operation Blackwater. It's been long enough. We believe parts of it can now be declassified. Enon blinked, my mind racing. Operation Blackwater was my masterpiece, a multi-year intelligence campaign that had dismantled a global terror financing network. It was the work I was proudest of, and it was buried under layers of the highest security clearance. The decision has been made, he said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. It's time we started recognizing our heroes in the shadows. The Department of the Navy has officially nominated you for the Distinguished Service Medal. And I felt the air leave my lungs. The Distinguished Service Medal. It was one of the highest non-combat honors, a recognition reserved for senior officers who displayed exceptionally meritorious service in a position of great responsibility. I was stunned into silence. He began to speak about my career, referencing specific operations, strategic successes, and analytical breakthroughs. Accomplishments I had locked away in classified files. Accomplishments even I had almost forgotten in the relentless churn of the next mission. He saw the whole picture, the entire tapestry of my career, not just the disconnected, meaningless threads my family perceived. Unfamiliar emotion swelled in my throat. On impulse, driven by the unexpected safety of this space, I heard myself confess the one thing I never spoke of. Sir, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My own family. They think I have a desk job. They think I push paper. And I expected a nod of sympathy, perhaps a look of pity. Instead, General Miller leaned back in his chair and let out a deep, booming laugh. It wasn't a laugh of ridicule. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated delight, of someone who appreciated a grand cosmic irony. In a desk job. He roared, shaking his head in disbelief. Well then, he leaned forward again, his eyes twinkling with a sudden, brilliant idea. In that case, I think we ought to give them the biggest surprise of their lives. And he paused, letting the idea form a master strategist seeing a new move on the board. Your brother's award ceremony is next month, isn't it? At Annapolis. And I nodded, confused. And how poetic would it be, he said, his smile widening, to recognize 2 of Captain Hayes' children on the same day. For 2 very different, but equally vital forms of service to this nation. And his words landed in the silent, barren landscape of my hope and bloomed. A wild, audacious idea took root in my mind. The thought that my truth, my real story, could finally be brought into the light, not by my own desperate explanations, but by the undeniable official recognition of the United States Navy. The thought was terrifying, and it was intoxicating. In the seed of hope, General Miller had planted felt fragile, a delicate green shoot in the barren soil of my heart. But my memory, a far more cynical and experienced gardener, immediately conjured the ghost of the last 4th of July, a day that served as a perfect, suffocating reminder of why such hope was a dangerous thing to entertain. And the scene replays in my mind like a worn-out home movie. a tableau of quintessential American perfection. My parents' sprawling backyard in suburban Virginia, heavy with the smoky, savory scent of burgers and hot dogs sizzling on my father's oversized gas grill. An American flag, Old Glory herself, waving proudly from a pole on the porch. A large blue Coleman cooler sweating in the afternoon sun packed with cans of Miller Lite and Coca-Cola. It was a picture-perfect Rockwellian painting of family and patriotism. And as always, I was just part of the background scenery, a detail to make the composition feel complete. The true focus, the sun around which our entire family solar system was forced to orbit, was Ethan. He held court on the freshly stained deck, a beer in hand, regaling a rapt audience with a tale from his last deployment in the Persian Gulf. It was a good story, I had to admit, full of roaring engines, tense standoffs, and split-second decisions. It was also about 80% fiction. I knew this because I had read the official after-action report, a document so classified that its existence was a secret. I knew that in the real event he was a supporting character, a competent officer who did his job. But here on his stage, under the adoring gaze of our father, he had given himself the starring role. My dad, his face beaming with a vicarious pride that was almost painful to watch, would nod along, interjecting with technical details about the FA-18 specs or the carrier group's protocols, lending his own authoritative weight to the embellished narrative. It was a play, a tired, predictable one they had been performing for my entire life, and I was, as always, the unwilling audience member, contractually obligated by blood to applaud a performance I knew was a fraud. Anna later, while my father and Ethan were deep in a debate about military spending, my mother caught my arm with a gentle but firm grip. "Come help me in the kitchen for a minute, dear," she said, her voice bright and conspiratorial. This was her signature move, the gentle summons to a private space for a not-so-gentle soul-crushing critique. And in the cool of the kitchen, she pulled a large bowl of potato salad from the refrigerator, her back to me as she fussed with the plastic wrap. "You see Jessica out there?" she began, her tone meticulously casual. "She just knows how to take care of Ethan. She makes his life so easy when he's home. It's a real gift, you know." She turned to face me, then her smile a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A career is a wonderful thing, Sophia. We're very proud of you, of course, but you mustn't forget about your own happiness." And I braced myself. I knew what was coming next. In my friend Carol from the book club, her son Mark. He's an orthopedic surgeon, you know, very successful, very handsome, and he's finally single again. I was just thinking, and I let her words wash over me, each one a tiny, perfectly aimed dart. It wasn't about my happiness. It was a judgment. It was a quiet, firm declaration that my life, the one I had sacrificed and fought for, the one I had painstakingly built for myself in the shadows, was fundamentally incomplete. My career, in her eyes, was not a source of pride or fulfillment, but a temporary placeholder, a waiting room for the only event that truly mattered in a woman's life, marriage. I wasn't a success. I was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied up in a neat matrimonial bow with a doctor. "And that's very thoughtful of you, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly even, a testament to years of practice. "But I'm happy." The lie felt thin and brittle in the air between us. When we returned to the patio, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the lawn. Ethan, now 3 beers in, was louder, his confidence amplified by the alcohol and the fawning audience. He spotted me, and with a boisterous laugh, draped a heavy, familiar arm over my shoulders. His gesture was a prelude to an attack disguised as brotherly affection. "And hey, sis," he said, his voice overly jovial. He pulled me a little closer, forcing the small group of his friends and our parents to pay attention. "I've been meaning to ask you." He paused for dramatic effect. "When are you going to put in for a transfer to a real position?" The question landed in the suddenly quiet circle like a grenade on. I mean, he continued, either oblivious or indifferent to the sudden tension somewhere. "You can actually make a difference must be pretty damn boring sitting in the Pentagon all day pushing paper." And there it was, the annual public dismissal of my entire life's work in front of everyone. He had reduced my career, my sacrifices, my secret victories, and crushing responsibilities to nothing. A boring, meaningless waste of time. He wasn't just asking a question. He was passing a verdict. Areno felt it then. A wall of ice beginning to form around my heart. A defense mechanism I had perfected over decades. It started at my core and spread outwards. A cold, crystalline barrier against the casual, smiling cruelty of his words. On the outside, I held my own smile in place. It was a polite, placid, utterly empty expression. "When I like my work, Ethan," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of calm. But inside, behind that wall, I felt a fundamental shift. The ice, which for years had been just a shield, was now becoming something else. It was getting higher, thicker. It was no longer just a defense, it was becoming a fortress. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was very, very close to reaching its peak. And have you ever had a moment where time seems to slow down? Where the world narrows to a single hyper-focused point of humiliation? That was me, standing at the gate with the guard's polite, dismissive words hanging in the air. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." And it's the politeness that makes it worse, isn't it? The professional, dispassionate tone that says, "This isn't personal. I'm just doing my job," when everything about the situation feels deeply, excruciatingly personal. My feet felt like they were cemented to the asphalt. I was an exhibit in a zoo of my own family's making, trapped in the spotlight of their casual cruelty. And then, through the thick, suffocating air, a new sound emerged. It was the quiet, confident purr of an engine you only find in a government-issued black sedan. The car glided to a stop beside us, and when the rear door opened, General Miller emerged. He was in his full dress uniform, and in the bright morning sun, the 4 stars on each of his shoulders seemed to burn with a light of their own. You know a leader when you see one. It's in the way they stand, the way they survey a scene in a single, all-encompassing glance. He saw me frozen. He saw the flustered guard, and he saw my family watching from a distance, and he ignored them as if they were part of the landscape. His focus was a laser beam aimed directly at me, and when he smiled, it was with a genuine warmth that melted a fraction of the ice around my heart. "In there you are, Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice carrying with an easy authority that could command fleets. "We were about to send out a search party." The words didn't just break the silence, they shattered it, Admiral Hayes, and you could almost physically see the gears grinding and then stripping inside the young petty officer's head. The stern mask of professionalism didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His face cycled through a series of emotions with comical speed. First blank confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally a wave of raw, unadulterated panic. His skin went pale. He had just been seconds away from physically ejecting a flag officer, a rear admiral from a Naval Academy event. He knew, and I knew, that in the rigid, unforgiving world of military hierarchy, he had just stared into the abyss of his own career. "Anna, Admiral, ma'am, my deepest, most sincere apologies," he stammered, his body snapping into a salute so sharp it was a miracle he didn't dislocate his shoulder. He practically threw himself at the gate controls, swinging the barrier open with a desperate, frantic urgency. And it's amazing what a title can do, isn't it? The first jarring taste of a power I had earned in the shadows was now on full display in the sun. General Miller placed a light guiding hand on my elbow. He leaned in, his voice a low, protective murmur for my ears only. "Are you all right, Sophia? Do I need to go have a word?" And then my gaze drifted past his shoulder to the three people who were my blood. They were staring, their mouths slightly agape. You've seen that look before, I'm sure. The look of utter slack-jawed bewilderment when the world as you know it has just been turned completely upside down. And the old Sophia, the ghost of the girl who spent her life desperate for a scrap of their approval, screamed inside me to say, "Yes, yes, go over there. Make them see. Make them understand." But that girl had died on this very spot just a few minutes ago. Itch and I turned back to the general, the fortress of ice around my heart now complete. I gave a single decisive shake of my head. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and colder than the recycled air in the tank. "That won't be necessary, General. Thank you." I let my eyes sweep over my family one last time. I have a feeling they'll figure it out on their own today. This was it. The crossroads. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. I would deny them the chance to prepare, to recalibrate, to craft a new performance of feigned, shocked pride. I wanted to see their unfiltered reactions. I wanted to watch them process the truth without any help from me. "Fenton." "As you wish, Admiral," General Miller said, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated respect. Seeing he straightened up, and with his hand still a firm, supportive presence on my elbow, began to escort me through the gate. He didn't just walk me in. He led me with purpose on a direct path toward the reserved VIP seating at the front. Our route took us right past the row where my family status kept my chin high. I kept my eyes fixed forward on the podium on the flag on my future. I did not grant them a single glance, but I felt their gaze on me like a physical force. As we passed, I heard it, a choked, incredulous whisper from my father to my brother, "Admiral," and that one word, spoken in a tone of utter disbelief by the man who had dismissed my life's work, was the final echoing drop. A lifetime of slights flashed through my mind, the ignored metal, the condescending jokes, the endless gushing praise for Ethan's real service, every moment of feeling invisible, of being told I wasn't enough. It all came to a head in that single whispered question. In the last drop had fallen. The glass was not just full, it had shattered. Since today was not about asking for their approval, that ship had sailed long ago, and I was finally letting go of the rope. Today was about forcing them to reckon with the truth they had so comfortably, so cruelly, chosen to ignore. My silence was over, but my answer wouldn't be spoken. It would be worn. It was in the 2 silver stars gleaming on each of my shoulders. General Miller led me to a private waiting room tucked away behind the main stage, a quiet sanctuary from the growing crowd. The room was simple, furnished with a few leather armchairs and a small table with a picture of ice water. He gave me a knowing nod. "Take a moment, Admiral. The ceremony begins in 15. Then he closed the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the faint muffled sounds of the brass band tuning up outside. Ingai walked over to the full-length mirror on the far wall. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, and yet more myself than I had ever been. There was a nervous energy thrumming just beneath my skin. The familiar adrenaline rush that comes before a major operation. This was no different. This was a strategic maneuver, one that required careful, deliberate preparation. In my hands moved with practiced precision. I slipped off the beige trench coat, the civilian armor I had worn for so long. I folded it neatly and placed it on a chair. It lay there, a soft, crumpled symbol of the person I used to pretend to be, a ghost. And beneath it was the crisp, immaculate uniform of the United States Navy, the service dress whites. I took a moment to adjust the fit, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders. Then, from a small velvet-lined box I took from my purse, I retrieved my rank insignia. 2 silver stars for each shoulder board. They were cool and heavy in my palm. This wasn't just about dressing for a ceremony. This was a silent, personal ritual. With slow, methodical movements, I affixed the stars to my shoulders. Each click of the pin into its fastening was a decisive sound, a final confirmation. Click. This is who I am. Click. This is what I have earned. Tani was no longer just Sophia Hayes, the quiet daughter. I was Rear Admiral Hayes, a flag officer in the most powerful navy in the world. I was dressing myself in the truth. Senator. When I stepped out of the waiting room and back into the designated VIP section, the atmosphere had changed. The seats were filling up. A sea of uniforms and formal attire. A few senior officers, a vice admiral I knew from the Joint Staff, and a Marine Corps general spotted me. Their faces lit up with genuine recognition. "In." "Admiral Hayes," the vice admiral said, extending his hand. "I heard they were finally declassifying Blackwater. A phenomenal piece of work. Congratulations. And long overdue, Sophia," the Marine general added with a gruff, approving smile. "You and your team ran circles around them. We owe you one for that." In each handshake, each word of praise from these men who understood the sacrifices, who spoke the same language of service and strategy, was like a brick being laid in the foundation of my confidence. It was a stark, almost painful contrast to the cold, confused stares I could feel coming from the guest section. My family didn't know me, but these people, my peers, my colleagues, they knew their respect was a shield, a solid, impenetrable wall of validation that I would carry with me into the battle ahead. And I took my assigned seat next to General Miller, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. And then I allowed myself to feel it, the weight of their gaze from across the aisle. I didn't need to look to know they were staring. I could feel the intensity of it, a mixture of disbelief and a dawning panicked confusion. And I could picture the scene perfectly. My father leaning in, whispering urgently to my mother fanning herself with the ceremony program, her eyes wide with shock, and Ethan, I could feel his stare most of all. It was a focused, burning beam of bewilderment. He would be looking at the 2 silver stars on my shoulders, the impossible, incomprehensible truth of them. In his mind, the math wouldn't add up. The sister he had mocked just an hour ago, the boring paper pusher, was wearing a rank that took most men a lifetime to achieve, if they ever did. And I met his gaze for a fraction of a second across the crowd, offering nothing more than a calm, polite, almost imperceptible nod. Then I turned my attention back to the stage, and the game had begun. But for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't a pawn, sacrificed for the sake of the king. On today, I was the queen, and I was about to checkmate them all. My silence now was more powerful than any argument I could ever make. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet intake of breath before the truth was finally spoken aloud. In the Master of Ceremonies, a captain with a voice as smooth as polished brass stepped up to the podium. And now for the presentation of the Navy and Marine Corps Combination Medal to Lieutenant Ethan Hayes for meritorious service in support of combat operations. Nye watched a silent observer in the front row. As my brother rose from his seat, he moved with the fluid, unshakable confidence of a man who has never had to question his place in the world. A man who has spent his entire life being told he was the hero of every story. He ascended the stage, accepted his medal with a practiced, humble dip of his head, and turned to the microphone as if he were born for the spotlight that now bathed him in a golden glow. In his acceptance speech was flawless, a masterclass in charm and filial piety. He thanked the Navy for the incredible honor, his commanding officers for their steadfast leadership. Then he turned his charismatic gaze toward our family. "I want to thank my father, Captain David Hayes," he said, his voice ringing with a sincerity that could move mountains, "for teaching me what it means to be a warrior, for showing me the path of duty, honor, and courage." He smiled at my mother, a warm, affectionate smile, and to my mother Margaret for her unending support and prayers. He then gave a subtle, charming wink to his wife, and of course to my beautiful wife Jessica for being my rock, my anchor in every storm. In he paused, then a performer's trick, letting the weight of his gratitude settle over the room. His eyes swept across the audience, a king surveying his court. For a fraction of a second, his gaze passed directly over me, sitting in the front row of the VIP section. There was no recognition, no emotion, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. It was as if he were looking at a piece of furniture, a stranger, a seat filler. Then he continued, concluding his speech with a final patriotic flourish that earned him a thunderous sustained applause. He never mentioned my name. In that very public, very deliberate omission in front of hundreds of his peers and our nation's most respected leaders, he had made his final definitive statement: "You do not exist." It was a deeper, more profound cut than any private insult ever could be. It was an eraser on a public record, a final declaration of my irrelevance. As he walked off the stage, soaking in the adoration, I felt the last faint flicker of any sisterly sentiment within me extinguish, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. And when the applause finally faded, General Miller did not return to his seat. Instead, with a quiet purpose that immediately drew every eye in the room, he walked to the podium. The entire auditorium, a moment ago filled with sound, fell into a sudden, expectant silence. A 4-star general going off script was an event in itself. "And ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice commanding the air, a low rumble that needed no amplification to reach the furthest corners of the hall. "We have a special unscheduled addition to today's ceremony. A recognition that for paramount reasons of national security has been kept secret from the public until this very moment." And a low, intrigued murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Ethan, now back in his seat, lean over and whisper to my father, a confused frown creasing his brow. General Miller continued, his words painting a vivid picture for the captivated audience. "We often and rightly honor the heroes we can see, the warfighters on the front lines, the pilots in the sky, the sailors on the seas. But there is another kind of hero, one who serves in the deepest shadows of the world, one whose victories are not measured in territory gained, but in tragedies averted, in lives saved. Their battlefield is a global network of whispers, data, and secrets." On the air was now thick with anticipation. The audience was leaning forward in their seats, completely under his spell. "On it today," the general boomed, his voice resonating with a fierce pride. "We have the distinct honor of finally recognizing the commander of the now declassified Operation Blackwater, one of the most successful and critically important intelligence operations in the modern history of the United States Navy." And I could hear my father's voice, a hoarse, confused rasp carrying across the aisle. "Blackwater? What the hell is Blackwater?" And then General Miller's gaze lifted from the crowd, sweeping over the rows until it landed directly on me. He held my gaze. A spotlight in human form and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "And ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor and my personal privilege to ask her to the stage. Rear Admiral Sophia Hayes." And for a single solitary heartbeat, there was nothing. Absolute deafening silence. The world seemed to hang, suspended in a universe of stunned disbelief. And then, like a brush fire, a wave of whispers swept through the auditorium. "Admiral Hayes? Did he say a rear admiral?" And an eye rose from my seat. In an "and" as I did, something extraordinary, something beautiful happened. Every single uniformed person in that room, from the youngest ensign in the back rows to the most decorated captains and generals in the front, rose to their feet as one. It wasn't planned. It wasn't coordinated. It was a reflex born of instinct, protocol, and a lifetime of ingrained discipline. It was respect. A cascading wave of white and blue uniforms, standing in silent, stunned deference. Señal except for 3 people in my family remained seated, frozen in their chairs as if a gorgon had turned them to stone. They were a tiny, isolated island of shock in a vast rising sea of honor. My father's face was a mask of pure, slack-jawed incomprehension. My mother's hand was pressed hard against her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was almost theatrical. And Ethan's face was ashen. The confident golden boy tan had vanished, replaced by a pale, sickly, almost green pore. Janai walked toward the stage. Each step was steady, deliberate, confident. I could feel the weight of my own power, the quiet, immense authority I had carried in secret for so long. I was no longer a shadow. I was walking into the light. So on the stage, General Miller took the Distinguished Service Medal from its rich, velvet-lined box. As he pinned the prestigious medal to my uniform, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper meant only for me. "Time to tell your story, Admiral." Annie turned back to the microphone, but he did not simply read the official dry citation. He told the story. Gunhi spoke of the youngest rear admiral in modern naval history. A ghost who had commanded a global intelligence network from the deepest parts of the shadow world. He spoke of strategic victories that had averted regional wars, of intel that had directly saved the lives of over 5,000 civilians in a single year. He painted a picture of a new kind of warfare, fought not with guns, but with intellect, and then he delivered the final devastating, perfectly aimed blow. "And just last year," he said, his voice ringing with emphasis, with purpose, "it was actionable intelligence gathered and analyzed in real time by Admiral Hayes's unit that directly resulted in a U.S. destroyer being saved from a catastrophic coordinated anti-ship missile ambush in the Persian Gulf." I let my eyes drift from the general, from the cheering crowd to my family, and I watched the truth detonate in their faces. My father looked like he had been physically struck, his body rigid, his eyes seeing something far away, replaying a history he never knew. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her knuckles white where her hand was pressed to her lips. But it was Ethan's face I will remember for the rest of my life. The blood drained from it completely. The confusion was gone, replaced by a sickening, horrifying dawn of absolute comprehension, and he knew exactly which destroyer that was. It was his. The applause felt like a distant ocean roar. Standing on that stage with the weight of the medal on my chest and the respect of my peers surrounding me, I felt a sense of quiet, profound release. The battle was over. The truth was out. At the reception that followed, a grand ballroom filled with the clinking of glasses and the low hum of important conversations. I was no longer a shadow. I was a center of gravity. A group of congressmen from the House Armed Services Committee were congratulating me when I saw them approach. My family. They moved together like a wounded animal, a tight defensive cluster cutting through the crowd, and Ethan was in the lead. His handsome face a hard, tight mask of fury. My father followed, his expression unreadable, a complex mixture of shock and something I couldn't yet name. My mother trailed behind, clutching my father's arm, her face pale. They stopped a few feet away. The congressman, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, politely excused themselves. Ethan didn't wait for them to be out of earshot. "And Rear Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. He spat the title like it was a curse. That was quite a performance. "Isn't my father?" remained silent, his eyes for the first time refusing to meet mine. "And you lied to us," Ethan continued, his voice rising, drawing a few curious glances. "You lied to all of us for 15 years. You let us believe you were nothing, a failure." And then I saw General Miller across the room catch my eye. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible signal to one of his aides. A young, polished lieutenant commander appeared at my elbow instantly. "In Admiral," the aide said smoothly, his voice a calm counterpoint to Ethan's rising anger. Perhaps this conversation would be more comfortable in the private conference room, and he led the way, and my family had no choice but to follow. The walk down the quiet, carpeted hallway felt like a march toward a final, unavoidable sentencing. Inside the soundproofed conference room, with the door firmly closed, Ethan's carefully contained rage finally exploded. "None. Why?" he yelled, his voice cracking. He began to pace the length of the room like a caged tiger, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why would you do that to us? You turned your own family into a laughingstock out there. You stood by and let me lecture you about sacrifice, about service. You were laughing at me the whole time, weren't you?" And he spun to face me, his eyes wild with a wounded pride. I knew all too well. It was the Hayes pride, the pride of the warrior. "And I was on the front lines," he shouted, jabbing a finger at his own chest. "Dad was on the front lines. We served. And you sat in a goddamn air-conditioned office playing war games on a computer, and you get a medal bigger than both of ours combined. It's a joke. It's insulting." On his words were a desperate, frantic attempt to rebuild the pedestal he had just been knocked from. He wasn't angry that I had lied. He was angry that I was more successful than he was. He was angry that my desk job had saved his life. And I let him vent. I let the storm of his ego break against the calm, silent fortress I had become. I walked over to the mahogany conference table, poured a glass of water from the crystal pitcher, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I waited until his shouting subsided into ragged, heavy breaths, and only then did I speak. My voice was quiet, devoid of any emotion, as flat and calm as a still lake. "And I was never laughing at you, Ethan," I said, setting the glass down with a soft click. "I was doing my job, a job that by its very nature required absolute secrecy." And I shifted my gaze from him to my father. For the first time, he looked me in the eye. "And did you ever once ask me about the specifics of my work, Dad?" I asked, my voice still quiet, still controlled. "Or did you just assume it was paper pushing because it didn't involve a weapon?" I turned to my mother, who was now weeping silently into a handkerchief. "Did you ever once ask me if I was happy with my career, Mom? Or did you just ask me when I was going to get married?" I looked back at all of them, the jury of my childhood. I didn't lie to anyone. I simply stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided they weren't going to listen. In my words hung in the air, a final damning verdict. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. My father, the indomitable Captain David Hayes, seemed to shrink before my eyes. He bowed his head, and in that moment, for the first time in my life, he looked old. He looked defeated. And just then, the sharp, distinct ring of my encrypted satellite phone cut through the silence. It was a sound that meant only one thing: duty calls. I glanced at the screen, then back at the shattered remains of my family. "How do I have to take this?" I said, my voice crisp and professional again. "It's a call I can't miss." And I turned and walked toward the door, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, my back to them. I allowed one last, a small piece of my old self to speak. "Ellen, I love you," I said, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "But I will not be dismissed by you ever again. If we are going to have a relationship from this day forward, it will be one that starts with respect. Real respect, John." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, a final non-negotiable term of surrender. And think about it. In and then I walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind me, leaving them alone in the echoing silence of the truth. 6 months passed, 6 months of careful, tentative steps across a newly drawn map. My ultimatum at the ceremony wasn't a finish line, it was a starting line for a different kind of relationship. When I wasn't sure my family was capable of running, and I walked into my parents' living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the first thing I noticed was something new against the far wall. It was a beautiful glass-fronted display cabinet made of dark cherry wood. My father was there, a soft cloth in his hand, carefully polishing the glass. His own medals and my grandfather's were arranged tastefully on the lower shelves. But in the center, on the main shelf, at eye level, sat my Navy Distinguished Service Medal. It was flanked by a framed high-resolution photograph of me on the stage at Annapolis with General Miller, pinning the medal to my uniform. And my mother came in from the kitchen carrying a plate of her classic chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the oven. She smiled at me, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Ken, your father built that last month," she said softly. "He said it was the first time the Hayes family display case told the whole story of service, and not the story of the men. Not a story of combat versus support. Just service." It was a small change in wording, a subtle shift in the family narrative, but it felt as significant as the moving of a continent. On that evening, dinner was different. The air was lighter. The usual performance was gone. There were no exaggerated war stories, no bravado. Instead, my father, after clearing his throat, looked at me across the dinner table. "Sophia," he began testing the name out. "What are the biggest challenges you face with personnel management at the Pentagon? With that many high-level civilians and officers, the politics must be complex." And it was a real question, a question born of genuine curiosity. Later, Hick Ethan talked about a new risk analysis protocol he was implementing on his ship. "It's funny," he said, not quite meeting my eye. "Some of the principles, I feel like I learned them from somewhere." He chanced a quick glance at me, a shy, almost embarrassed smile touching his lips. It was his way of acknowledging my world, of admitting its value without having to say the words directly. In and then, my mother raised her wine glass. "A toast," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not to the men of the family, but to the strength and intelligence of all the Hayes children in all their forms." We all clinked Ked glasses. The oppressive, competitive tension that had defined every family meal I could remember was gone, replaced by a quiet, fragile, but very real warmth. And after dinner, Ethan and I found ourselves on the old wooden swing on the back porch, a place where we'd spent countless childhood summer evenings. For a long time, we just sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the chirping of the crickets. I mean, he was the one who spoke first, his voice low and devoid of its usual arrogance. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he said, his eyes fixed on the dark treen at the edge of the yard. "The way I treated you, the things I said about your work, it was never about you. It was about me." And he took a shaky breath. I needed to be the hero. I needed it to feel like I was living up to Dad's expectations, to the family name. I was so insecure that I couldn't stand to see that you had found your own way, a way that I didn't understand. And his confession was a balm, a healing medicine for a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. And I felt a real smile, A genuine, unforced smile spread across my face. "Thank you for saying that, Ethan," I said softly. I looked out at the yard at the fireflies beginning to blink in the twilight. For the longest time, I thought I needed this, family's approval to feel whole. I thought my value was something you all had to give me. He and I placed a hand over my own heart. But all those years of being misunderstood, they taught me something more important. My worth isn't determined by anyone else. It's right here. It always was. I looked at him. Having you all finally see it, that's a gift. A wonderful gift. But it's not a prerequisite anymore. Nathan nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding on his face. "I'm really proud to be your brother, Sophia." And for the first time, I could say it and mean it with every fiber of my being. "Anne, I'm proud to be your sister." In the peace I felt in that moment wasn't a victory. It was something better. It was acceptance. It was a dawn I had made for myself. Admiral Sophia Hayes's journey is a powerful reminder that our true worth is never determined by others. Perhaps her story brought to mind a moment in your own life, a time you had to draw a line in the sand or when you realized your peace of mind was non-negotiable. And we believe those moments deserve to be honored. If you've ever felt like Sophia, let us know in the comments below. For more stories that empower and validate, subscribe to Chosen Revenge, where a new story is always waiting to honor yours. Your experience matters here.